When Genesis says that we're made in God's image, it uses the word for idol. That doesn't seem very Christian. So what does it mean, and how should it affect the way that we see humanity? In churches today, we hear that phrase all the time, but we have almost no explanation for what it means. Does it mean we physically look like God? That we have three parts to our being, like He does? That we have a soul or intellect or something else? These are all explanations that I've heard from churches across the United States, and they all fall short because they don't take into account the ancient context where we find the phrase. So what is it? That's exactly what we're going to be talking about over the next few videos in this series on the image of God. We're going to trace the theme and what it means all the way from Genesis to Colossians, find out why it's in the Bible, and how it can change every aspect of the way we live. So let's get into it, and let's start with the original language of Genesis and see what might be hidden in plain sight. I'm Joshua, a Jesus follower and truth seeker. Welcome back to The Truth in Tension, where we ask old questions in new ways. Let's start with a bit of Bible reading. In Genesis 1:26 and 27, it says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' And God created man in His own image. In the image of God created He him. Male and female He created them." Now, many of us are familiar with this passage, but what we may not know is the word used for image. The word in Hebrew is tselem, and quite literally, it means idol. Yes, it's the same word used to reference the idols of Baal, Hun, Moloch, and all the rest. Like this? Well, kinda. I know it's shocking, but when we just understand a few things about this word, it's going to become, well, still shocking, but in different ways. In ancient cultures, idols weren't just objects. They weren't things that had ambiguous and abstract spiritual ties to something more powerful. They were physical points of contact between the divine and the earthly, embodiments of a divine force placed specifically in temple spaces, which I'll do a whole video on eventually. For now, just know that a temple space is where the ancients believed heaven met earth, where the home of the gods intersected with the home of mankind. There's a lot to unpack here, and we're just getting started, so let's get to unpacking. When the ancients prayed at shrines or temples where the idols were, they never were praying to the idol itself. They were praying to the god that the idol represented. If they prayed at a shrine to Baal, before an idol of Baal, they weren't praying to the stone figurine. They focused their prayer through the middleman because they didn't believe they could communicate with that god aside from through the idol. These were physical representations of a god that people believed to be much more powerful. As such, it had certain attributes that made it physically resemble a god, which is where we get the belief that we physically look like God somehow. Maybe it would be made of something that represented the god. Stone for steadfastness, gold for glory, silver for purity, and on and on and on. I wonder what we'd learn about the nature of our own God if we meditated on the fact that we are made of clay. But more important than the physical characteristics is that as a representation of the god, the idol served as a middleman between the divine and its creation. It represented the god to all of creation with all of that god's power and authority, and represented all of creation back to that God, with all the responsibility that comes with that. In some ancient cultures, like Egypt, which the Israelites had just come out of, this was because the spirit of that God had breathed into the mouth of the idol and thus lived inside it. Sound familiar? An idol was the focal point for the presence of the divine in this world. That is who we are created to be. In this light, I wonder if the command to not make graven images was at least in part because we are those images, formed from the clay and breathed into by the Spirit of God. Now, imagine hearing this phrase, the image of God, right after escaping Egypt, a place where only one man was allowed to have that title. What Genesis said next would have turned their entire world upside down. In ancient Egypt, where the Israelites came from when they received the Torah, or the books of Moses, there was one man who was allowed to claim the title image of God or the gods, and that was Pharaoh. He was the only person who could claim the divine authority of representing the gods to men. In this, Genesis undermines the hierarchy set up by oppressors, making everyone images of God and wielders of divine authority. Not the king, the rich, the elite, the strong, the men, the eloquent, the racial majority, or any other person or group. God took a people made slave by the Egyptians and showed them that they were the very bearers of his divine image. That is beautiful. Rejecting the oppressive hierarchical structures that kept the rich rich, the poor poor, and the slaves slaves, God radically changed our perception of self-worth from how many bricks we can make to something much more intrinsic and tied to his very own being. Because God is worthy, we are worthy. We were the idols he placed in his temple of the world. Are you beginning to see the scandal of this phrase as the Egyptians saw it? As the Israelites saw it coming out of Egypt? It was like getting on Instagram and taking away all of the celebrities' blue check marks. Or better yet, giving a blue check mark to everyone else to make a statement. This is radical egalitarianism, making every person the idol of God in his holy temple, from women to slaves to eunuchs. No more were they livestock or second-class citizens. They were wielders of divine power and authority. Every person is sacred. But this isn't just a compliment. It is a charge and a responsibility to govern well in the place of God because we are his image. God wants to raise up the slaves and make them royalty. He wants to raise up the outcasts and make them priests. He wants to raise up the neglected and give them purpose. This is the image, and it's not only Pharaoh who bears it. But this isn't just about Egypt. If we really believe that everyone is the image of God, even today, then that should change how we see everyone, including ourselves. And here's what I mean by that. If we are that, the idol of God, the place where heaven meets earth, the divine presence in physical form, wielding authority and power, then that should affect some things about the way we live. And I think that starts with a core assumption about people. Every human carries divine dignity. That homeless man, that refugee, that immigrant, whether or not they're legal, that child in foster care, that person you disagree with politically, they are all God's image, and to harm them is to vandalize God's temple, and to degrade them is to degrade God's own presence. When we realize this, we realize that there are no more pharaohs. No empire, leader, pastor, influencer, or system can claim more divinity than another. Genesis demolishes that hierarchy. The divine image belongs to all of us, equally and irrevocably. Cult leaders and politicians might try to change this, accepting all manner of worship for themselves in the place of God, but no one, not Donald Trump, not Bill Gates, not Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, not your pastor, not your parents, not anyone is more divine than the least of these. Because we were never meant to be worshipped, but to reflect the one who made us. That means reflecting compassion, justice, creativity, patience, truth, and above all, reflecting perfect love to all people. So to be the image, or tselem, it's not an abstract thing. It's a concrete vocation wherein we are to be the physical representations of the God who created us, filled with his spirit and wielding his authority and power to govern well. And all of us bear that image, from kings to slaves. It destroys hierarchies, ends oppression, and establishes us as the idols of a God who fills his temple with his glory. That is, if you bear God's image, you carry divine authority and divine responsibility. But what exactly is that authority and responsibility? We'll look at that in the next video on the image, which you can find here when I have it. I'll see you over there. Until then, go in peace, walk in truth, follow always the law of love.